One of the senior Democrats on the subcommittee with bankruptcy jurisdiction was a congressman named Mike Sinar from Oklahoma. And they were the respective sponsors of these bills. Not only would take away the household good liens issue, eliminate the co-debtor stay, which allowed people to file Chapter 13 to prevent their mothers from getting sued on their debts.
So it protected co-signers, where the only reason to have a co-signer was simply not because they were going to get anything from the loan, but rather because Sonny wanted a car, and mom co-signed on the car.
Because moms are
Right.
moms.
And when you filed the Chapter 13, she got a stay too.
Yes.
Right, as long as the underlying debt was being paid in full.
Right.
Sure. So
Yeah.
we would do a lot of cases where they needed to protect a relative. They did the 13 specifically for that purpose. And there are other debts they could get relief on. So they wanted to eliminate that. They wanted to
A super discharge.
they wanted to curb the Chapter 13 broader discharge that was there for many types of debts, which we call the super discharge. They also wanted to curb the Chapter 7 discharge for debtors based on credit card usage. They wanted to change the standard of what would be considered fraud. And effectively, I remember at the time that basically if somebody was unemployed while they used their credit card, they could be used against them on a dischargeability complaint. I mean, they made the standard so watered down. And all of these things were being touted in Congress as good ideas. So in the fall of '91, I talked to my colleagues, Norma and the rest of this group, and I said, well, we should have our bankruptcy and commercial law section of the county bar give us a subcommittee that we can track this legislation and make recommendations. So we set that up. We had about 4 or 5 meetings. And of course, being a county bar group, it was open to debtor lawyers and creditor lawyers. Well, amongst our group, we found ourselves with some advocates from the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And when we brought up some of these problems that we saw evolving, they weren't problems to them.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal, we started off at the county bar level, was we would bring these to the county bar, get them to recommend a resolution that would go to the State Bar of California, and the State Bar would go on record saying, don't make these changes. Or make other changes that are beneficial. So we soon, within a few months, we found that that vehicle wasn't going to work. Around the same time, but we started talking amongst each other about we've got to find some way to get involved here, because this stuff's on a train in Washington, and there weren't any consumer debtor advocates.
Yeah, and
as
that's
groups.
right. That's right.
They were
And
individuals.
the only group that even bordered on this would have been associated with the NACTT, the National Association of Chapter 13 Trustees, that did have a debtor's auxiliary, but they were not activist.
Their
in any
interests
way.
also didn't coincide directly with yours, did
No,
they?
on some issues, yes,
Yes.
but
Not the overall
they were like
organization.
a
Right.
stepchild of the NACTT. They really
Yeah,
didn't
the
have
debtors, the
independence.
debtors auxiliary, they were more like us.
And I was
but-
referring to the National Association.
NACTT,
That
right.
that their interests,
Yeah.
that the Chapter 13
Yeah.
trustees' interests did not necessarily
Right.
directly coincide with your
Yeah,
interests.
absolutely.
Right.
Nor did they believe that they could be an advocacy group with the independence of a debtor's attorney.
Did you
Right.
try to get the ABI, the American Bankruptcy Institute, interested in this?
No, when we looked at the ABI, we saw that was largely
It was going to be the
dominated
same thing
by-
as the state bar, you know?
By, well, it seemed like their focus was in a different area. As also, it was a blend.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to be.
Creditors.
It could never be a debtor advocacy
Right.
group, because they had members from all areas of the bankruptcy practice.
Yeah.
So I remember I think it was like in March or so of 1992, I saw that they had held a hearing on some of these bills that were going forward. And I decided one afternoon to call Washington and ask to speak to Senator Heflin's legislative director and just say, I got to tell them they're on the wrong track. So I asked for the legislative director. He wasn't available, but another fellow working on it was. His name was Jeff Hartley. Later became a member of the National Bankruptcy Review Commission. But at that time, he was one of the staffers. And so I called Mr. Hartley. I introduced myself, and I said, I practice bankruptcy in San Jose, and I understand you have these proposals, and they're really have some very bad ideas that will really harm consumers. And he responded by saying, well, we just had hearings and we had, the consumer point of view was broadly represented there. And I said, I didn't see those on the list. I said, can you tell me some of the consumer representatives? And he proceeded to recite several trade associations of the financial services that had the word consumer in their name.
Now, at that time, was there a financial services roundtable?
I don't know if there was, but there was a National Consumer Bankruptcy Coalition. There was the retail, there were other entities that were carrying the water for the major credit card industry, and certainly the mortgage bankers were there.
Right.
Yeah.
And
But now let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
Hal Heflin was from Alabama, is that
Yes.
correct?
Right.
And was he a Republican or a Democrat?
Democrat.
Okay. And this would have been, so about 1992.
Yes.
And of course, Mike Sinar was a Democrat
Yeah.
also. Okay, so let me go ahead then.
So during this conversation with Mr. Hartley, once he mentioned the National Consumer Bankruptcy Coalition, a bell rang. I knew who they were. That was Sears and a coalition of retail credit entities. And I protested. I said, that's not a consumer group. I said, they represent the... And when I said that, he kind of laughed. And he said, well, you might be right, but it won't make any difference. And that was that phone call. And
Yeah, it's when somebody says something like that to you that, we're a little feisty. And
that
what?
was the equivalent of a poke in my eye with a sharp stick.
Yeah.
So I remember we had one of our monthly lunch and seminars where we'd have at restaurant Rue de Paris, the commercial law section would have somebody come and speak on bankruptcy. You came in once there. And I shared this with my colleagues, that this is the response I said. And I talked to Norma about this. We'd gotten to know each other working on these issues, and I said, we need to have a national group because there's nobody there and they're mischaracterizing what's going on. Otherwise, we're stuck. And our colleagues said, go do it.
Yeah, you go do the work.
So we sat down with Norma's husband, Jim.
Well, it wasn't that easy.
And we
That
figured out how
wasn't that wait. No, you had to work on me a long time before I said yes, because I actually knew how hard it was to set up a nonprofit organization. Like I mentioned before, I'd done that kind of thing in the 60s and 70s. So here I had a daughter who was 4 years old and two sons, 6 and 8, and a law practice. And I'm going, do I want to commit to the amount of work that it's going to take to set up an organization? Because I know what it is. And he was blissfully ignorant.
No, I had the benefit of not thinking about all the work that was in front of us.
Yeah.
Which
work.
aided me in pursuing this goal.
So it took a while for him to convince me, but right about that time was when he convinced me. And I said, okay, look, you're right. We have to do something. So
we found that our respective skill sets or talents or interests complemented each other well.
Yeah.
And so we sort of divided this labor in different directions. I would take the lead on doing the organizational work, the proselytizing, speaking, being outward, the advocate, helping to round up some national individuals to join us. And Norma and her husband Jim would focus on more the organizational, administrative support structure we were going to need. So we actually laid out a plan to form NACBA, and we started off by talking about targeting the NACTT conference that was coming up that summer. We knew there was going to be a decent segment of national lawyers there, not just the San Jose Bar. And
where was that?
that was going to be in Palm Springs, middle of summer. They had a really low rate.
I didn't want to go. I said, okay, you can go. I'm not going.
When I got there, I said, what am I doing here? So we targeted that group. We went back to Phil Bloor, who had been a veteran of that. We asked Phil if he would take me down there and take me around and introduce me to everybody. And Phil was completely enthusiastic and willing to
And
help
before
us.
you left,
You made a brochure.
we did a brochure, a 3-panel brochure Our first brochure.
But before, to have a brochure, to have something, we figured we can't go down with just an idea. We need to come down with something that's already been, there's some substance to it, a structure of some kind. So we had an organizational meeting in my law office building, and we invited, in the San Jose area, about 30 or so lawyers to come. And we had about 10 that made the meeting and another 15 or so that said that they would join. And at that meeting, we went over different names, and we were trying to pick a name that had a good acronym. So we shot down the Consumer Bankruptcy Attorneys of America, because you couldn't say that. And we settled on NACBA, because they had the word national in it, and they had Consumer Bankruptcy Attorneys.
Do you remember the date of that meeting?
June 30th,
Yeah.
1992.
92, okay.
Yeah.
So at that meeting,
He was just looking at the agenda for it.
Okay.
So we set the dues structure. We had to have an initial dues structure. We decided that the basic membership fee would be $100 a year. And for lawyers that had large practices, which we deemed to be 500 or more cases a year, they would pay $300. And if you were an additional lawyer in the same firm, it would be $50 extra for that lawyer. So we had a dues structure, we had a name, we set some goals, the things that we wanted to be interested in, and that we could sell when I went to Palm Springs.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time frame, we realized we couldn't just have San Jose lawyers be the board of directors for this group. We needed to have a national representation. And there, got some very helpful advice from Marilyn Morgan, who was then on the bench. And we talked to Marilyn about what we were doing, and I asked her suggestions, what she had in mind. And she had come across the names of Henry Sommer, who was a renowned consumer bankruptcy lawyer and community legal services attorney
In Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia. Also, she knew of Gary Klein, who was a very well-known consumer advocate with the National Consumer Law Center in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
She also knew of a very prominent Chapter 7 trustee in her trustee work. Marilyn had met her, named Elizabeth Peterson in Durham, North Carolina. So I made some calls, cold calls, if you will, to Henry Sommer and to Gary Klein, and also to a fellow, Jeff Friedman. Jeff Friedman had the largest practice in Western New York. He was based in Buffalo. And Jeff was the person that the NACTT had designated to put their debtor workshops together at their program. So Jeff had the ability to showcase this. So I called Jeff Friedman up, and he's a very direct person with a good sense of humor.
Yeah, great sense of humor.
And I said, Jeff, I'm Mike Shulman in San Jose. We're starting this group, and the response was, he says, well, I don't know you, and I don't know anything about you. And I said, well, I come from Elmira, New York, which was 150 miles from Buffalo. And he says he has an uncle in Elmira. He says, why don't you call me back in a week? So I called him back. This is how it happened. I called him back in a week, and he says, I talked to my uncle, and he said he didn't know you. He says, but he says he knew the Shulmans. He says it's a good family. I'll let you do this.
How old was he at the time?
Jeff?
Oh, he's about our age.
He's maybe at the time he was probably in his early 40s.
Yeah.
So we got Jeff engaged.
Yeah.
So we then had a plan of attack for the NACT conference. We were going to get a forum. We were going to have a captive audience. We had a brochure.
Mm-hmm.
One more thing happened that really helped us gel, which was there was a former congressional staff woman named Suzanne Bingham.
Mm-hmm.
And Suzanne had branched out into a private business where she would track legislation for many different bankruptcy groups, the bankruptcy judges, trustees. She would do a newsletter, and she did some administrative work for some of them. Well, she went in to see our then Congressman Don Edwards, who, as you know, is the author of the 78 Code and Prime Force in consumer bankruptcy. And she was talking to Don Edwards about bankruptcy, and he said, well, you should talk to Ike Shulman in San Jose, because I'd gotten to know Don and become a friend of his over the as our local Congress member. So Suzanne called me up out of the blue and she said, I just got your name and I understand you're organizing this group. She says, I'd like to help you. She says, I'll be at the NACTT conference. Do you want me to help you get this organized? And Norma and I said, great. So Suzanne was down there for that meeting. She helped us work the room. We had a presentation. There were probably 60 to 65 debtor attorneys at that conference from all over the country. And at the end of it, 90% of them had signed up to join NACBA. So that really gave us a national footprint.
So we were collecting the checks. We weren't yet incorporated, but that was happening within a month or so.
Yeah, that happened in August of 92, a couple weeks later.
Yeah.
So having these nationally known names like Henry Summer, Gary Klein, gave us credibility beyond who are you? You're from San Jose. That doesn't sound too national.
Now, I think we've answered some, we've covered a lot of territory here, that there, frankly, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that there really wasn't an organization for consumer bankruptcy practitioners prior to NACBA
Right.
that was solely for them.
Right.
Yes, but what I would say is what we found is this was a hunger that our
Yeah.
group satisfied.
Yeah.
And after I got to know my colleagues, at the previous meeting the year before, I've been told in Vancouver, when the NACTT met and the debtor attorneys got together, they started talking about this idea, many of them. So many people saw the need for this.
It was an idea whose time had come.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And that there were, basically there were legislative matters that were kind of cooking in Congress at the time, hadn't gotten to the point of really becoming, to the floor of the House or the Senate, but that there were committees that were looking into all of these things. Were there this all was occurring at the tail end of a recession. Did that have anything to do with what was going on at the time?
Well, I think I would just say because all of us knew how valuable the services we were providing to our communities and running a business, from a business perspective, this was a successful business you were in, and you got to help people. And all of a sudden they're talking about taking it away. So the fact that the recession was there just made the value of what they might lose be maybe more prominent. They didn't want to see all these tools stripped away from people.
Yeah, and let me just back up a little bit. Not only was the legislation discussed, but there was actually a vote, and I don't know whether it was at the Senate Judiciary Committee or it might have been at the No, it was on the floor of the Senate, I believe, because it was a horrendous vote. It was like 98-0 or something, and this was like I think in May, and
Of 92.
Of 92. And Ike and I had been in touch with Senator Metzenbaum's staff because he was
From Ohio.
Yes, from
Yeah.
Ohio. You know him very well, I'm sure. He was the only one that cared about consumer issues at all at the time. And so we'd been working with his staffer, Pam Banks. And so I had written a letter. We'd written individual letters, and she was very supportive, but she said, Metzenbaum read part of my letter on the floor or whatever. I don't know what it was, but nothing, it didn't do any good. It was pretty clear. It was like, it was an overwhelming vote. And so it was not just these things are floating around, but I mean, it was like, whoa, this is going to actually get passed if we don't do something.
Well, I think there were many signs out there that there was major trouble brewing, and they really didn't even, we thought many of the senior legislators didn't even understand the impact that this was going to have. And
They weren't hearing from anybody from
other than
your side.
they were hearing from one side
Right.
that they had a problem and not much on the other side.
Right. Yeah.
There were individual lawyers both before NACBA formed and after who had testified individually. One of, even in 1984, Henry Summer had been testified before Congress a number of times. Another attorney who later became a NACBA board member and president, Matt Mason from Detroit. Matt was one of the managers of the UAW Group Legal Services plan there. And Matt had testified in 1984, before we even formed NACBA, when the reaffirmation hearings were being
Well, I
held.
think that was when they were first talking about, I
And-
think they
and
just brought in
707B.
the expense, we had to do the budgets. They brought in the budgets, the ability to pay.
I think they
Kind of
changed
thing,
the
yeah.
substantial abuse language in 707B. So there were people there before trying on an individual basis, but they didn't
But
have
that-
the
That didn't
backstop
have the
of an
effect that we
organization.
needed.
Even the National Bankruptcy Conference, which traditionally has been involved in legislative affairs, it sounds like, well, I'll ask you, did they participate in that legislative debate at that time?
They weighed in, I think, with letters, probably supporting some of the same positions that NACBA took on behalf of consumer debtors. But there.
And I'm talking about specifically in '92 before.
In '92.
Uh,
Was Henry
Henry was
he
was
active
on
At
in
that
the National
time?
Bankruptcy
Yeah.
I think he
Conference,
still
yeah.
is, but.
Yeah, well, I know that he has
Well,
been
for a
since,
while,
I
he was
don't know.
the chair of the consumer section of that
Right,
group.
right, but he was the only consumer representative
I
for
think
years.
their name went out there in supporting us on some
Uh-huh.
of the issues early on, but I don't think they had the active energy
Right.
to put into it
Mhm.
that we did.
Well, let's see, you've talked about your, the organizational meeting of NACBA took place here, in San Jose that is. And by the way, we're in San Francisco, I should note, in the offices of JAMS, and because I didn't say it earlier, it is September 11th, 2015. In any event, that first meeting took place in San, when did you have your first nationwide meeting?
So that was,
That's kinda fun.
that was in August of '93.
Okay, and who were your board members at that point?
So at that time, the initial founding board was, and officers were Norma, who was the treasurer, I was the president, and Jeff Friedman from Buffalo was vice president, and the secretary was Elizabeth Peterson.
She wasn't actually on the board.
At that time.
Our bylaws provided that officers didn't need to be board
I
members.
see.
But she joined the board later.
Uh-huh.
And Henry Summer was on the board at the time. So it was Jeff Friedman, Henry Summer, Gary Klein, Norma, and myself was the initial five. We shortly thereafter added, within a short period of
Yeah.
time,
It was, I think,
Jill Michaud of Topeka,
we
and
expand.
How do you spell that name?
Michaux. Jill currently is the consumer representative on the National Advisory Committee on the Rules, appointed by Justice Roberts a few years ago. So we got Jill, and Jill had been very active at the NACTT, so she helped us organize within that.
So we started with
organization.
5 board members and immediately expanded it to 7. So we picked up Jill and then Mel Kaplan
Yes.
from
And
Chicago.
that's Kaplan?
Right.
Yes.
Henry Summer is Sommer, right?
Yes.
Right.
Okay. Well, this is for transcript
Yes,
purposes.
and Klein is Klein.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
So we had our first